Well, this is a love story. It's a love story, and it's also a story about the passage of time. And it's called The Naiad of the Lake. And once upon a time, there was a young knight. And this young knight, he had only just been knighted. He'd only just become a knight, and he was a very, very young man. He was wearing beautiful, shiny new armour, which, to tell the truth, was a little bit on the big side for him as yet. He had no beard on his chin. He was very young indeed. But he had a fine horse and a purse of money in his pocket. He was well connected, and he couldn't wait to begin his adventures as a knight. And he was riding along through a part of the countryside that was very strange to him, and he found himself on the shores of a beautiful lake. And it was very, very early in the morning. The dawn had only just come up, and the yellow irises were dipping their silver leaves into the water of the lake, and the wind just blew a little ripple across it. And the people that lived in those parts, they said that in that lake there lived a Naiad, a water spirit. She was said to be as old as time itself, beautiful, deathless, ever lovely, and she dwelt in a palace at the bottom of the lake, which was ornamented with shells and pearls, and little fishes swam in and out. But the young man, the knight, he knew nothing of this. He didn't know the area. It was a new place to him altogether. And as he was riding along the shores of the lake, he noticed sitting amongst the yellow irises the most beautiful young woman he'd ever seen in his entire life. She was just sitting there, watching the waters of the lake. She was completely lovely. And he looked at her from where he was, seated on his horse, for a long moment, and then he rode his horse over to her, and he got off and he knelt before her, and he said, "Lady, you are the fairest woman I have ever seen. I am a very young knight, and as yet I am untried, but I hope and I believe that when the time comes, I will be brave. But I have no lady to wear my colours, no lady that I can call myself her knight. Would you be my lady? Would you wear my colours and watch me in the jousting, and let me come and lay my brave deeds before your feet?" And the lady, who of course was the Naiad, she looked at the young man very coldly, and she said, "Do you know who I am?" And he said, "I know only that you are fair." And she said, "I am the Naiad of this lake. I have been here since the beginning of time, and I will be here beyond the end of time. I am ageless, deathless, and forever lovely. You are a mortal man. You are of no use to me. You will grow old and you will die just like all other men. I wonder that you dare even to speak to me. Be gone now, go on your way." But the knight pleaded with her. He said, "I ask nothing more of you than just to wear my colours, just to let me present you with my brave deeds. Nothing more than that." She said, "Be gone before I grow angry." And at last the young man began to realise that there was no hope for him. And he said, Is that it then? You really don't want to be my lady? You won't let me lay my brave deeds before you?" And she said, "No, there is nothing that you can do that will change my mind." So the young man got back onto his horse, and very slowly and sadly, with his head bowed, he began to ride away. But the Naiad thought of something, and she called out to him, and she said, "Sir Knight." And he turned very hopefully. She said, "There is one thing. 700 years ago, I lost a ring in the lake. It was a ring that I was very fond of. It was swallowed by a fish, and a fisherman caught that fish. I have never seen it again. I should like to have that ring back. If you can find the ring for me, you can bring it back to me here. Then you can be my knight. I'll do better than that. If you can find my ring, you can come and live with me in peace for eternity in my lake home, my palace beneath the waters. If you can find that ring." And then she laughed, and the sound of her laugh was like the tinkling of the water against the pebbles on the edge of the lake, because she didn't believe that the knight would ever be able to find the ring. And he said, "I will find it for you. If it takes me my whole life, what does it look like?" And she said, "It glows with a strange red fire. If you hold it over water, it will shine blue. If you hold it over grass, it will glow green. That is how you will know it. Find it for me, and these promises shall be yours." And the knight said, "I will find it. I will find it. Farewell." And he began to ride off. And every now and then he'd look back at her, and she was still sitting there amongst the irises, until at last he looked back and she had gone back into the lake. Well, the young man was so happy. He had a lady, so he hoped, and he had a quest. And he spent the rest of his time searching for the ring. He searched all over the country. He went to castles, to hovels, to ordinary homes. He asked everyone that he met if they had seen the ring, and his quest took him all over the world. Everybody he asked thought he was very strange. His friends couldn't understand that he would spend his life on this quest. He gave up friendship, chances of love, his entire fortune that was considerable in the quest for the ring. He travelled abroad. He went to consult with the wise men of the East to see if any of them had found the ring, but nobody had. He went by night to the witches and wizards of the West and asked them, and occasionally, throughout the years, he would meet someone who had either heard of it once, told him a story, or perhaps had known of somebody that had seen it. And once he met a very, very old woman on her deathbed who had held it just for a moment in her hand when she was young and fair, but he never found the ring. And life passed him by. He travelled onwards and onwards, across the seas and back again in his quest for the ring, and he never found it. And the years passed and the years passed, and he was old. He was an old man. His entire fortune had gone. His armour was rusty. He no longer had the fine horse that he had started out on. Now all that he could afford was a bony old nag. And he found himself back in the rutted lanes of England, and he was riding along, and by now he was all bent up with arthritis. His sword was rusty, it had lost its scabbard, and he was riding along when he realised that the horse was lame. And he thought to himself wearily, it must have a stone in its hoof again. So he got down off the horse and he lifted up its hoof, and he took out his sword and he used the point of the rusty sword to prise out whatever it was in the horse's hoof. And something shining red winked out. It winked out and fell into the ruts of the lane. And the old knight, his eyesight wasn't very good by now, but he looked down and he picked it up. It was a ring, and the ring shone with a strange red fire, and his heart began to beat faster. He picked it up with his thumb and forefinger, and he held it up to the light, and then he passed it over the grass. It glowed green. And then he went over to a muddy ditch full of water. He passed it over the water. It shone with a strange blue fire. It was the Naiad's ring. He couldn't believe it. He put it onto the smallest finger of one of his bony, arthritic-y old hands to keep it safe. And he turned his horse around and he carried on in the direction of the Naiad's lake. And it was a long way. It was some hundreds of miles. And for the last part of the journey, he had to sell his old horse in order to get food for the journey. And so it was that he went the rest of the way on foot. He was footsore and he was weary and he was limping with his arthritis and he was leaning on a staff. And at last he found himself on the edge of the lake. He was so happy. He thought, I can give the Naiad her ring. She'll keep her promise. And he wasn't in a hurry now. He'd found it. He'd spent 50 years on his quest. 50 long years. He was an old man in his 70s now. And before he called to the Naiad, he knelt himself down at the edge of the lake. He was very thirsty, and he cupped his hands, and he was just about to have a drink when he saw his reflection. He saw his old bony face, lined and haggard and marked, the wrinkles, the thinning hair that was white now that had once been gold. And he thought to himself, I got old. How did that happen? When did that happen? And he thought to himself, I can't hold her to her promise now. She's young and beautiful, and I'm just an old man. What would she want with me? Let her have her ring. And he took the ring off his finger and he threw it as hard as he could into the lake. And then he rose with difficulty to his feet. And he thought to himself, I need to just go and find some place where I can sit by the fire and live out my old age, perhaps a monastery. And he began to limp sadly away. But then he heard a voice calling him, Sir Knight, Sir Knight. He turned around and the sun was in his eyes. He couldn't see very well, but he could see a form dressed in blue, and it was the Naiad. And she said, Sir Knight, why are you going without calling me? And he said, I am an old man now. You have your ring. You were right. I'm of no use to you now. I'm just an old man. Have your ring. I'm so glad that I've been able to find it for you. But she came up to him and she slipped her hand into his and she said, come. And she led him down to the edge of the water and she said, look. And they looked into the water together, and the knight could see that he was no longer old. He was young, his face was unlined, his armour was shining again, his hair was shining gold just like it had been, and together they walked into the waters of the lake, and the lake closed over their heads, and he lived there with the Naiad in the palace under the water to the end of time. And that's the story of the Naiad and the lake.